and welcome to the What, Why, When podcast from Oxford University. My name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics at Jesus College and the Access Fellow there. I'm here with two fantastic guests here to talk about all things Superman today. So going in alphabetical order, can we kick off with you, Andy?
Yeah, I'm Andy Schwabel. I'm a third-year student here at Jesus College, Oxford, doing history and politics, and I'm delighted to be here.
Fab, thanks, Andy. And Danny?
Yeah, my name's Danny, and I'm also a third year, and I'm studying history here at Jesus.
Fantastic. So I had one of those classic sort of childish questions in my mind that I wanted to try and thrash out with you guys. So my question was, why on earth does Superman look like that, right? He's got a pretty outrageous costume going on. He's got what I would call pants over leggings. He's all primary coloured up. He's looking a bit strange, isn't he? But we've somewhat perhaps taken for granted what an odd look, an odd aesthetic that is. So I wondered if we can sort of figure it out and then get a bit deeper into why we even have Superman and what it reflects about society and stuff like that. So how about just the general look? If you were to sort of deconstruct the look, Andy, what do you think is going on there? How would you explain it?
Yeah, well, he's bright red, blue, yellow primary colors. He's definitely got pants on over his leggings. He's got a crazy cape, sort of, because
the cape,
all of it's very skin tight, but then he's got this cape going around.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. He's got, and also I guess there's obviously, if we're talking about Superman's outfit, there's also Clark Kent outfit that he rips off.
Yes,
It's very, like, sort of
and
business.
no one can tell it's him.
Yeah, the glasses.
Yeah,
that's right.
right.
Yeah. The whole thing. I mean, I guess this is what we're going to get into in a second, but isn't the whole thing that he's sort of an alien, so it has to feel, somewhat foreign?
Right, yeah, absolutely.
But
But
at the same time, it has to sort of be something that appeals to these sort of, very human senses of what makes you powerful. Like, we can see he's muscular.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and you're very close to already cracking why he wears pants over leggings. Danny, any other sort of initial thoughts on the look?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting, like the Clark Kent versus Superman thing, that probably when you're designing a cartoon, you're wanting as big as contrast as you can get between sort of the person who's just normal and human like us, and then how do you immediately make him look super? Well, you're going to have a cape and you're going to get his abs out and you're going to do crazy colours.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's the figure hugging, it's the abs, it's the muscularity of it all, which is basically explains the pants over leggings. So he wasn't actually the first to show that look. Flash Gordon came out a few years earlier. So if we say Action Comics #1 is June 1938, so that's Superman's first ever outing. And Flash Gordon predates that by a few years, and he wore what we might now delicately call a posing pouch, the sort of thing that muscly bodybuilders would wear. And that's basically the look they were going for, that circus strongmen of the era and in the 19th century would have worn something similar to show off their musculature. So that's kind of why there are the pants on the outside, because until you start thinking about it, it's a weird look, isn't it? What about the primary colours? What do you think is going on there? I mean, you mentioned just the dissimilarity, or making it look so different because he's an alien.
Yeah.
But any other sort of thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, for one, it's, eye-catching.
Exactly, yeah.
I also think, the primary color is, like, obviously red, and Superman, he's very much couched in American patriotism, right?
Right.
Truth, justice, and the American way.
Right.
And you have this red and blue, which is, these very sort of, American colors. But I guess you're adding the yellow, that almost makes him stand out. Maybe it suggests a sort of, like, perhaps he's an exemplar of these American values, or maybe superior to them even.
Yeah, I think eye-catching is absolutely crucial first point, because, of course, if you imagine a newsstand in 1930s America and you're trying to appeal to the eyeballs of lots of young people, then having it all primary colours, given that was a relatively new technology to print in all primary colours, that's something you want to exploit to the fullest. What about the cape? So have you seen The Incredibles, Danny?
Yeah.
No capes.
No capes.
Why has he got a cape, do you imagine?
Oh, well, I guess there's an element where the people historically that are wearing capes are the most powerful people in society. Maybe it's sort of linked with royalty, perhaps.
Yeah.
And I guess it's probably a signal that he can fly, I suppose, if you're wearing a cape, and that's adds to the whole sort of drama of flying.
Absolutely. So again, if you're thinking about a static medium like a comic book, to give that sense of movement through air, cape works much better. If you imagine him just wearing the figure hugging business and he's got his arm out, you wouldn't necessarily, what's going on? Is he falling? But the cape gives a bit of forward momentum, right? So again, it's a sort of a visual language to help us understand that. And now, again, we've just completely taken it for granted, right? That is the superhero look. If you were to turn up in a fancy dress party, you would need bold colours, some sort of hyper stylized logo, right? And that's another part of his look, isn't it? The sort of fantastic S on his chest. and all the rest of it. What about hair? Did you know, Andy, that in the 1970s films with Christopher Reeve, his hair is parted differently depending on whether he's Clark Kent or Superman?
I did not. Good fun fact.
For the view of the audience, it's parted on the left-hand side when he's Clark Kent, and when he's Superman, it's parted on the right. Now, I guess this is all part of his incredible disguise, right? He moves his hair over. But there's also an interesting psychological theory that we instinctively distrust things that come from the left. Have you heard about this? That left in Latin means like sinister. Yeah. So go on, tell us more about that. What's going on there?
Oh, I'm not sure I have that much more to say. I mean, obviously we live in a right-handed world.
Right.
And I think anything that's a little different is a little off-putting, isn't it? Including just Superman being dressed like that.
And it's quite common in films to give this sense of progress as being movement towards the right. So if you have montages, then characters tend to move from the left of the screen to the right. Danny, have you ever played the classic Mario platform game?
Yeah. So
Mario, when he's progressing in his journey, he has to go from to the right of the screen, doesn't he? If he's going left, something's gone wrong, right?
Yeah, you're running from Bowser.
So there's a sort of very subtle, unconscious psychological cues to tell us, oh, this is right, this is movement, this is progress. But it's strange, though, isn't it? I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I wonder if sort of Mario was invented in, say, the Arabic world, whether it would be going the other way. Is it to do with Is it to do with our writing, I wonder, or sort of with?
I think that's right, exactly. Yeah, and of course Mario comes from Japan, where they do actually write from right to left.
Oh yeah,
in the Arabic world, I mean, and also top to bottom. So you're right. It perhaps ought to have been the other way around, but they obviously knew their market well. So he's a New York plumber. Anyway, let's not get into that. That's another podcast to deal with Mario. Let's get into some of the history. You guys are both historians. So the concept of Superman is sometimes, and I think slightly misleadingly, attributed or credited to Friedrich Nietzsche, who's a 19th century German philosopher. And he came up with this idea of the Übermensch. Now, this has been slightly sort of picked up by Nazis and all sorts of unsavory people, because his idea of a Superman, it's not a terribly good translation, but anyway, is very different to the Superman we are familiar with. Because whereas the Superman we have is this, he's fighting for justice and he looks out for the little guy, and he's sort of wrapping humanity in his cape in a loving way. The Übermensch for Nietzsche is not like that. The Übermensch is a sort of amoral character who just takes whatever he and it was pretty much always he wants from this world. Mm-hmm. Nietzsche was reacting against Christianity, which he detested. He saw it as a slave ideology. It was developed by slaves in the Roman Empire, and it was to compensate themselves for their enslavement. They were basically saying, oh, turn the other cheek because we've been treated so badly by the Romans. And Nietzsche despised them for this. So his idea of the Übermensch was the person who had no morality and just took whatever they wanted from this world. So very different idea to Superman, is it not, Andy? I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, of course. Well, I feel like sort of, Nietzsche's Übermensch is sort of better than the world, right? He lives by different rules. Whereas Superman, rather than being better than the world, is just an exemplar of the best in the world, right? Which is why he has this sort of, he can be a normal person, and then all of a sudden he becomes, Superman, but he's still got the same sort of like, organs and body or whatever. Right. And I guess it might be what we're going to talk about later. And I don't know that much about Superman, but it is obviously like made by like Jewish immigrants to the United States, right?
Yeah.
So you have this whole thing about like, how do we fit in as immigrants? Are we like Americans? Are we like fundamentally different? And maybe they're suggesting that, we are, in a very, key way different, but also this makes us, better contributors to the society we live in, which is sort of using, what Nietzsche is saying in Germany, but actually in many ways turning that on its head.
Yeah, interesting. What do you make of it, Danny?
Yeah, I think it's interesting talking about Nietzsche's view on Christianity. I think like through history, you often see this sort of contradiction within like masculinity between a sort of Christian ideal of maybe sort of self-sacrifice and meekness, and then a maybe more often real world view of sort of power through strength and violence. And I think you can sort of look both ways, and there's often been a lot of criticism of a Christian view of masculinity that it sort of weakened things, and I think Gibbon sort of famously thought this was part of why the Roman Empire fell apart, because they accepted Christianity. Right,
and the Superman legend sort of walks a bit of a tightrope, doesn't it? Because Clark Kent is sort of slightly meek and he's sometimes portrayed. Yeah, it's like, as a bit pathetic, right? But at the same time, Superman is not just this rampaging, amoral monster, is he? So, how do you think they walk that tightrope?
Yeah, I mean, maybe part of it is just sort of appealing to in terms of this difference between Clark Kent and Superman, I guess we're at an age where like society's becoming a lot more professional. People are working in offices.
Right.
Maybe a lot of people think they are sort of Clark Kent, just really
right.
working in office, really boring.
It's a bit wish fulfillment.
Yeah, you're appealing to something deep inside that says, I think a lot of people have probably said, oh, well, if I saw, some like attack happen and I could be a hero.
Right. And, well, in what sense do you think it's therefore important that he is a man? Because he's an alien, right? I mean, surely he could be a genderless being, an entity without any sort of sexual orientation whatsoever, right?
Yeah.
And yet he's conspicuously Superman. I mean, I wonder whether you think that is because men are more likely to demand that sort of content. And any sort of superhero stories for women are often a little bit derivative, slightly weak, arguably. I mean, I'd be interested to know what the audience's views are on that. Basically, I'm asking you, are more heroes men because men aspire to that sort of thing, do you think?
Yeah, it's probably a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Where we have this thing where men are aspiring to this, but it's because this culture is creating this. You kind of create a loop, don't you? But no, I mean, certainly our image of this sort of like hero, the guy who saves the day, the exemplar citizen, certainly in the era they're inventing Superman, and probably still today, is a man, and he's sort of taking care of the women who are all, at home or doing their domestic things.
So it's a classic bit of economics, right? And that it could be that men demand it, but it could also be that it has been supplied, and so it's a supply side problem. So, Danny, I mean, do you speculate that if there were just better heroes that were targeted to women, that might actually just develop that demand, or do you think there's something within the male psyche that is either anxious or seeking that fantasy of being a superhero?
Yeah, I wonder. I think probably. I'd imagine, I'm not really that into comics, but I imagine in the last few years there has been a growing sort of supply of comics towards women to sort of fill that gap. And I know, I imagine the community is becoming more diverse in that sense. I'm pretty uninformed on it, to be honest.
Well, fair enough. But it's you're right. The market has certainly diversified, but slightly late. So you've got the sort of Captain Marvels and the She-Hulks and things like that. And to a certain extent, as I say, they seem to be slightly derivative of the male archetype heroes. And it's after literally thousands of years of superhero stories all being men. I mean, the oldest surviving piece of written literature is the myth of Gilgamesh, which comes from the Sumerian Empire, which is a male superhero. It feels like that cultures and civilizations throughout the world at different times have gone back to the same well of, imagine if we had supernatural powers, wouldn't that be cool? So I don't know whether this is part of not necessarily the human condition so much as the male condition.
Yeah. Now, I wonder if this is, I don't know, enough, history of literature to say this, but I wonder if a lot of, male heroes are all about these, like, superpowers. People who are stronger than they otherwise would be naturally, and maybe a more female hero, which is, or a hero that appeals to a more female audience, is more sort of making do with the powers they already have.
Yeah. Go on, Dan.
I think it's probably also worth thinking about who's writing these things. I don't think it's probably not a mixed panel of men and women writing it. Right. I imagine when Superman's invented, there's mostly men in the room deciding what the world wants.
Yeah, and imagining a male audience who's walking to work and has coins in their pocket.
Right. Yeah, and you mentioned the authorship earlier, Andy, that it was Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and they clearly didn't realize that they were about to make $1 billion brand because they sold it for 130 quid. Dollars. And were later destitute and were given a pension by Warner Media when it was $1 billion brand. I mean, Action Comics #1 was sold at auction a few years back for $3.25 million. And it's just about the market economics of it, Andy. I mean, what's your reaction to that? It's such a huge property. How could you explain that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it almost feels hard to talk about because it's such an archetype, isn't it? Like, Superman is like, now, decades on, we look at Superman and say this is kind of boring conceptually because all these new superheroes are like Superman, but they have this feature.
Right. Yeah.
It almost feels like Superman, the only thing that's special is that he's super, but he almost invented them.
Right, yeah.
Maybe, it's a stroke of luck for the people who wrote it, but I think they did create a character that's, just so, like, basic that he can just appeal to people, right? You can project sort of what you feel onto him.
Well, and building on that appeal, so we've spoke about Nietzsche as sort of perhaps part of the background story of it, but clearly talking about a very different type of superness. There's also Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the two sort of psychoanalysts from Austria who are worth talking about because, I mean, Freud in particular, we tend to talk about splitting the the psyche into three parts: the id, which are sort of base instincts or sort of sexual desires and things like that; the ego, which is the thing that tends to regulate our behavior; and the superego, which is the morality that we feel from a society. I mean, is Superman just just embodying that super ego? Is he he's fighting for justice and he's telling us how to live a good life? Is he sort of providing some of the morality that people might historically have taken out of scripture or other sources, Danny?
Yeah, I think maybe you're right, and maybe it's even more unabashed and confident than what you might get in scripture, that it's sort of saying you can be good, but also you're going to be really powerful,
right,
and you're going to save the world, and women will be
badass.
Really into you, and all of this. Like, you probably don't get that in many sort of holy texts,
No.
and maybe it's sort of reflective of a confidence that can only be found in America in the 20th century.
Right.
Sort of, yeah.
What do you reckon, Andy?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's true. I think without knowing, again, that much about Superman, it's also so a product of this sort of new, like, just sort of emerging, like, industrial consumerist age. Like, definitely, I know the picture of the first Superman cover, right? He's lifting up a car, and, like, what better example of a new America than, a car, an automobile. So yeah, maybe it is just sort of adapting this, age-old story of sort of...
Well, absolutely. And again, the car has got white wall tyres, which is kind of associated with gangsters of the era. So it was pretty clear from the second you saw it that he's the goodie. And by the way, he's progressing to the right-hand side of the comic. Right. And the villains are all crawling to the left, so don't forget that. If someone's sinister, they're always moving leftwards. So it could be, I mean, again, we could go back to Nietzsche, who wrote in a different book that God is dead and we have killed him, that as society was moving from the late 19th to the early 20th century, there was the march of secularism, the scientific method was taking over. Maybe people wanted to go back to stories, they wanted to revert to some sort of clarity when it came to morals that were beginning to become a little bit more nebulous. What do you reckon, Danny?
Yeah, I think people always need a story, I suppose, don't they? That's what, like, the world is built on. And I think probably Superman is telling a simple story and the story is sort of I don't know. To me, it feels like this is sort of saying America's the good guys, and we're more powerful than everyone else, but we're doing it right, and we're not like sort of the imperial powers of the past. We're the goodies, but also we get to be really strong.
Definitely, and so sometimes comics and graphic novels get bundled up in a move towards what we can broadly call postmodernism. So if modernism is the triumph of the scientific method and the Enlightenment, that questions can be answered and truths can be exposed. Postmodernism pours a bit of cold water on that, suggests that there's clear limits to what science can uncover. And in the absence of absolute final answers on things, we come back to stories, that narratives help us inform what actually is going on in the world. And religion is a source of those narratives, but as are actual stories. And another aspect of postmodernism is that it sort of tends to turn in on itself. It tends to sort of reflect on the fact that we're telling stories a lot of the time. So one of the intriguing things about Superman is that he creates this counter-Superman meta culture. So for example, there's Batman, who's like the anti-Superman. And that's very much a commentary on this Knight of Justice, this White Knight, where you've got the Dark Knight who skulks in caves and lives with the bats and is reviled by everyone and is very clearly a human being, not an alien. And that sort of clear distinction between types of heroism is quite meta, as we might say, because it's reflecting on the nature of superheroes. Is that clear? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think probably if that makes even more sense when you look at what's actually remained popular, that no one's made a Superman film in a long time, right?
But there's one due out soon.
Oh, is that? Okay. Yeah. Completely wrong then, sorry.
But still, but that's an interesting point. No, but what were you going with that? What was your theory?
I was just thinking that maybe Superman is too good to be true. And,
right.
And so, I mean, the Dark Knight films, for example, were unbelievably popular, weren't they? But sort of are a bit of a broken confidence. And
so you think that we're more inclined towards Superman in times when times are good, that we're sort of more receptive to that story of there's good and evil and clarity then?
I mean, potentially, but not now. I've heard there's a new Superman film coming out.
But they might have reconfigured the character a bit. I don't know, but Andy.
I don't know. One thing I might say about Superman versus Batman is that in their sort of day jobs, Superman's like just a kind of boring reporter, just an office guy. And that does that maybe speak to the time when a lot of people are becoming sort of middle management. A lot of people are immigrants and they want to see a sort of heroism. Batman, his day job is he's like a billionaire.
Right.
And I think there's certainly now, and I think for a while now, there's people have this very real fear that there's sort of billionaire overlords in the world. It's actually maybe in a way comforting to say, even though these billionaire guys are like actually kind of creepy and like dark and spooky, they're actually good guys and they're going to save us at the end of the day.
Right.
Which I think that might be very comforting in the world.
That's an interesting point. Yeah.
I mean, or maybe like nowadays the billionaires in charge of the movie studios don't want to sign off on a film about billionaires. They want to keep the They want the
or
the office.
Aliens coming in smashing all of their it's a good point. I mean, and there's been some more extreme meta commentaries on superheroes, so things like The Watchmen by Alan Moore, if you've ever read that or seen the films, the various sort of productions of that, or The Boys, which is another sort of basically anti-heroes, right? So the counterpoint to Superman is the hero that is amoral. It's kind of getting back to the sort of Nietzschean idea that you just take what you want, right? You've got all this power. Why wouldn't you just grab everything? To take all the money, take all the power, take all the glory. That sort of genre of anti-heroes is, as you were suggesting, Danny, pretty popular. And again, I speculate here, but I suspect it's still quite popular with male audiences. I mean, but I could be clutching at straws there. What are your thoughts?
I mean, me and Andy the other day watched an episode of Beast Games. Have you seen Beast? It's Mr. Beast's new game show, which we thought was very dystopian. It's got 1,000 people and they're competing to sort of pay off their mum's mortgage, it feels like. And they all being like plunged into the darkness. But I think the reason that maybe gets the green light is people in sort of maybe what feels like desperate times want to see a bit of their own. It's maybe relatable to think, I would sell out my neighbour for some cash. I don't know. Yeah.
No, it's interesting. And we haven't. Well, I mean, it's intriguing that there is still Superman going about. It's still a viable brand. I mean, do you think it still has much relevance to the contemporary world, Andy? That character, that figure.
Yeah, definitely. I think what we're just talking about is how even these sort of anti-Superman figures, which maybe are quite popular today, they can only exist because we're aware of what Superman looks like. And I think a lot of political discourse, without getting into it too much, we have obviously in 2016, Trump's whole thing was Make America Great Again. Is that sort of reaching back to this Superman morality when a lot of people have given up on that, and he's saying this is a better world. If you vote for me, we can sort of get back to this world where there's clear cut, good and bad and that sort of thing. So I think probably the existence of sort of anti-Superman figures just proves the longevity of Superman.
And this sort of sense of masculinity being associated with obvious physical strength and things like that, right?
Yeah. Which I think is maybe, I don't know, maybe we're getting too politically, but I feel like that is, the right is telling a really compelling story actually in the world right now, and that's why I think the far right is making big gains. It's a simple story, isn't it? Let's go back to being Superman and a world where everything felt simpler and better, and maybe the left has yet to sort of tell a story that really wins people over.
Definitely, and that's back to some postmodernism, right? That stories are simple, stories are accessible. If you say that the world is full of some good people and some bad people, it's easy for everyone to latch onto. The minute you sort of say, well, actually, it's all shades of grey and it's a bit more complicated, then it's harder to engage people. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in terms of its popularity, I mean, sometimes it's described as a bit of a subculture. So the implication that people need to be slightly surreptitious about their love of superheroes and comics. In other words, Danny, you couldn't just walk down the street rocking a Superman outfit without raising a few eyebrows and maybe attracting the attention of the local constabulary, right? So, but I guess the question I have is why? Why do some people feel slightly abashed about their enjoyment of comic books, do you imagine?
Well, I suppose maybe if it is a bit of escapism, sort of, you want to read about someone powerful, I don't know, maybe that signals, or at least you feel it signals a sort of lack of power in yourself, maybe. I wonder. Yeah.
What do you reckon, Andy?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an acceptable level of sort of engagement with it, because you look at the box office, like these Superman movies are like, they destroy the box office.
Right.
So it's almost like we're all supposed to sort of know a little bit about this, but to know too much is a problem, which I think might be, You might even, I mean, I'm not saying it's generally, but I think a lot of people might even have that feeling towards religion. Like, they'll be a little bit religious. They'll, go to church on Christmas and Easter, but are quite suspicious of people they would consider, fanatical.
Enthusiastic.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's that sort of standard construction of comic book nerd, right?
Yeah.
That sort of 3-word phrase. It's very damning, isn't it? It's quite
It's maybe
toxic.
maybe if what we're saying about Superman is that he's the sort of dream person, that we're all Clark Kent and we think we could be Superman.
Yeah.
Maybe we look at these, comic book nerds and say, oh, they're pathetic. They know they're Clark Kent. They're just desperate to be
Sure.
Superman.
I also wonder if it comes from a time when, if you were staying inside reading comic books, it means you weren't outside sort of hanging out with
baseball.
people. Whereas nowadays, I mean, probably everyone's spending a lot more time inside on their own on screens. So
Well, that's it. It's so much more mainstream. It feels like we're not really challenging that bullying effectively of certain people for just enjoying a certain genre. I don't know. Am I being too woke and sensitive?
no, I think there's probably always sort of certain things which you're allowed to be enthusiastic about. Maybe they're often male, and like it's fine to be obsessed with football and know every score from the last season, right? That's just cool. But if you knew the same about comic books, maybe it wouldn't be. And maybe there's a male female aspect to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, a comic book is literally just kind of like arty, isn't it? Like, a comic book, someone's drawn that. It's not, the football is like people are moving, using their muscles, they're sweating. I don't know.
Yeah. So again, it's coming back to sort of archetypes of masculinity,
Yeah.
and I suppose that's where Superman just confuses me so much, because you're right, it is literature, right? And some young men don't feel like they can proudly talk about books they're reading necessarily. There's a bit of an anti-intellectualism that you sometimes find, whereas, as you say, being into sports is fine. I guess this is me sort of therapizing myself as an Oxford tutor. But it's okay to like books, isn't it? But yeah, it's just as with the whole thing of Superman, I just find it really fascinating. So guys, final question for you both, and I want honest answers. What is your superhero outfit? What are you rocking? What colours? What's your logo going to look like? Give us the lowdown.
What a question. I mean, that's tough. I mean, the S is powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, so you need some sort of A.
Oh, he's Schwabel.
Schwabel, I could keep the S.
Just steal the S.
Yeah, I kind of like, our Oxford College coat of arms. Imagine 3 stags on your chest.
Right? So for listeners, 3 stags is the Jesus College logo. Yeah, we can have them with lasers out their eyes or something.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, that would be really powerful,
Yeah,
I think.
very muscly stags. Yeah.
Definitely have. I don't think I'd want to be so skin tight, to be honest. But but could you still be a Superman with sort of more baggy trousers or whatever?
Well,
It'd be very 21st century.
Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting look. So baggy trousered, 3 stags.
3 stags. Definitely cape though.
Okay, definitely cape.
Yeah, we'd blow in the wind nicely. I reckon.
Okay, Danny, over to you.
Well, Jesus College has recently opened its new gym, and I've really been working on my abs. They're looking good, so I think something skin tight would work for me.
Right.
Yeah. I just think.
Very nice. Well, thank you very much, both of you. It's been a lot of fun talking about Superman and why he wears such an odd outfit and the various other aspects of the superhero genre. And yeah, thank you for everyone listening. Do tune in next time to the What, Why, When podcast, when we'll talk about something completely different. Thanks, everyone. Bye.